I'm very glad that we can meet this evening with Dr. Irina Kustova. She's a researcher in the Energy Climate House at the CEPS, the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels. You know, it's an independent think tank, and the school has an agreement with CEPS. The reason why we ask Irina to give a lecture this evening is that she's an expert in the field, and she has been doing research on the implementation of the EU Green Deal, on the decarbonization of energy industries and the transition in core region. And as you know, all these issues are at the core of the Next Generation EU, and of course, more in general, of the next of the Commission plan for the future. Irina has worked before CEPS in other institutions, in Energy Charter Secretariat, on regional electricity market, energy transit, and dispute settlement. And before that, she was at the Agency for Cooperation Energy Regulators. Irina is an alumna of the School of International Studies because she graduated and she concluded her PhD in 2015. So we are very glad that she is back home. We would like to think of the school as a home for her. And she's going to give a lecture titled Delivering Climate Neutrality by 2050, the Manageable Challenges of the European Green Deal. So thank you, Irina, for accepting the invitation and being here with us this evening.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And thank you everyone who joined this lecture already after work day. So in the evening, I hope it will be interesting. And indeed, it's great to come back to my alma mater, to the place where I did my doctorate, where I started my very long and very exciting research journey. Unfortunately, we can do it only online. That's a big disappointment, but it's better than nothing. So I hope everything will go smooth, internet connection will be stable. And if I'm not mistaken, I see here also Professor Rosa attending this lecture, and that's also a great honor for me to see my PhD supervisor who supported me during my doctoral journey, full of discoveries and difficulties and challenges, and that was great. And I think that there are many doctorate students, master students among the participants, and I wish you all good luck in your research. And this is a very interesting path for all of us, I think. So I would like also to mention that I will share now my presentation, my slides. So they can be shared to anyone who is interested to get a copy. So no need to write down everything. You may listen to me. And the video is being recorded, so you will get it as well. And in the end of the presentation, I attached a list of tentative readings if you want to expand your knowledge on this topic from our team from CEPS, Energy Climate House. So feel free to use it as well. And I need to underline that this lecture I'm doing in my own capacity. Anything I'm saying here does not represent the vision, the position of CEPS, Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels. This is my personal opinion as a researcher. So I start trying sharing the screen. And Andrea, maybe let me know if everything is okay.
Now we can see.
Okay, perfect. So when I was asked to deliver a presentation on the Green Deal, and I think this has become a really a highly debatable and highly discussed issue across Europe and in Brussels bubble. Of course, we have been discussing it since its publication in December 2019. So when I was asked to discuss climate and energy policies, I thought that, okay, I would like to give an overview, because the Green Deal is very big, is very large, is about everything. And in the end, it's very nice to have an overview of what is happening and what goals do we have to achieve by 2050, and what challenges should we take into account. That's why I put my presentation's title, Delivering Climate Neutrality by 2050, the Manageable Challenges of the EU Green Deal. And I would like to underline, to draw your attention to the word manageable, because I see this exercise as, of course, a reality check, but I would put it as an optimistic reality check. So we need to check what should be done, what inconsistencies do we have between different policies, different subsectors, and how we can move forward. So that's why what I'm going to discuss today, there are two big questions, and we can spend several weeks discussing all these issues, and it will be not enough. And that's what we are doing in Brussels. So the first one is actually about what is Green Deal about. What is new? And I put this, an updated nice proverb, new wine in old bottles, saying that the Green Deal is definitely something new, while it is based, of course, on the previous experience. And the second part of this presentation, I will devote to assessment. Will it work? Will the Green Deal work? And I will try to summarize challenges and some questions that we need to take into account, that we need to assess in order to deliver what we want to get by 2050. So the first slide, well, the first part of the presentation is about, okay, what is the Green Deal about? And I think all of you know that last December, the new Commission presented the communication on the European Green Deal. And all in all, the Green Deal was aimed and is aimed to reset commitments to tackle climate change, to tackle climate policies. And the main rationale behind the entire framework is to show that climate policy, to bring climate policy to economy, and to show that climate policy can have economic benefits and economic rationales behind it. And in this regard, the European Green Deal is about low carbon economy. And it is not only about net zero, so it's not only about decarbonization, but it's also about a low carbon economic growth. So how to change the entire EU economy. And it's not only about energy, it's not only about industry or transport, it's about all sectors of economies. How to shift to a low carbon development, but at the same time to ensure economic growth. And that was a comprehensive communication, which this year was developed in several other initiatives by the Commission. And the second part of the title of this slide, new wine in old bottles. And that's really true, because the Green Deal is a logical extension of previous strategies. Those of you who study EU energy policies, EU climate policies, you all know 2020 targets, which actually need to be assessed in the end of this year. 2020 targets, then of course liberalization of gas and electricity markets during mid-2000. And of course, we all know about this famous triangle: competitiveness, security of supply, and environment protection, so climate policy. That all was, let's put it so, in the previous decade. And the previous commission, the Juncker's Commission, came up with also very catchy framework, very catchy concept, the Energy Union, which actually attempted to bring together all these three dimension of policies, of EU policies, to actually to build it into the Energy Union. And currently, and of course, the European Green Deal is built on this, well, on these building bricks, if I say it correctly, of the previous Commission's initiatives, and it takes a step further. And the Green Deal, of course, also relies on the European Commission's long-term strategy. It was published in November 2014, or 18, I'm sorry, A Clean Planet for All, which actually provided the 8 scenarios. How can we achieve climate neutrality by 2050? What directions should we prioritize? And climate neutrality is all about climate change, is about the Paris Agreement governance structures, initiatives, and of course the European Union is not alone, while I would say that it was among the first, let's put it so, if not the first, and the most ambitious. So the European Union aims to set up an example for climate neutrality or carbon neutrality. But of course, it's not alone. And in the European Union, Sweden and Finland were among pioneers to declare their ambitious goals to become climate neutral. You see on the slide by 2045, by 2035, and also UK, not in the EU any longer, by 2050. And recently, in recent months, we just heard from Japan and China and South Korea. The former two were a bit hesitant to join the club of carbon neutrality by 2050 or 2060, but recently they also publicly announced that they are aiming to this goal. So, and I think anyone who read the communication, of course, saw this very nice graph, very nice picture, what is the European Green is about. Sorry. And what is interesting is that all these sectors, you can see, of course, greenhouse gas emission reductions, energy, circular economy, transport, so mobility, industry, agriculture. Of course, all of them have been addressed, were addressed in the past by various EU policies. But this time, the European Green Deal brings all of them together in what is called in EU jargon mainstreaming exercise. So bringing all together to align them to climate objectives. So all these sectors will need to answer the question how they should become low carbon. And in regarding energy, of course, we spoke about energy efficiency before, renewables and security of supply, but now another new topic is about low carbon gas. You heard about hydrogen, even if you don't study energy policies. We will discuss it later. Then, of course, in industry, it was the European Union did a lot on pollution control, stricter rules, tighter rules. But now it's also the time for industries to transform into low carbon business. So, for example, we are speaking about low carbon steel, low carbon cement, and it is a new reality. It is what these industries need to achieve. In mobility, of course, we spoke about new technologies and clean transport, electric transport was on the table for quite a time. And now we also start discussing new concepts, car sharing, different types of new public transport and whatever. And in housing, of course, we discussed building, in housing and buildings, we discussed energy efficiency of buildings as that was addressed at the EU level. And now we move to another step. It's about construction materials. They should be low carbon. And we come back to the industry which needs to provide these low carbon materials. In agriculture and food, well, it's all about the reform of the common agricultural policy, which is also a very sensitive issue which faces some debates and opposition, also among stakeholders. I think you saw it in news. And if we have a look at the two blue brackets, it's about financing, it's about money. So where does money come from? And it's about leaving no one behind, the catch-up slogan of the European Commission. So it's all about just transition, that all this transformation shall not produce inequalities, further inequalities, and we will discuss it also further. In my presentation today, during the discussion, I will focus mostly on the energy part, so on the energy square, because just to address all these sectors, it will take a week of lectures. So I focus on energy, and I will try to show you the main discussion points. I don't want to put them as controversies, but let's put them as questions or challenges to be addressed, to be taken into account in order to achieve this goal of climate neutrality by 2050. So tentatively, I identified 7 of them, and I just list them, and then I will discuss each one by one. So it's about political institutional factors, just transition, as I mentioned, and 3 aspects of decarbonizing energy sector. So what is clean energy? Do we have a common understanding? What challenges does electrification bring to the EU economy and to the power sector? And hydrogen. So where do we stand with hydrogen, and what opportunities do we have? Another aspect is investments. So decarbonization means a lot of renewables. I will speak about it later. And it means that a lot of new capacities need to be installed. A lot of new technologies need to be implemented. And that brings us to the discussion of investment protection. Which investments should be protected? It became very, very topical and very debatable topic in the European Union in recent months. And sustainable finance, so which assets, which energy can qualify as clean energy. And the last external dimension, of course, the European Union wants to become a leader in climate policies and in decarbonization efforts, in global efforts for climate change. And of course, the question is how to deal with the neighbors and global emitters and neighbors on the European continent. And that's a big question, is about carbon leakages. And I'm sure you heard about the carbon border adjustment mechanisms in any form. And that is also a big, big question nowadays in the European Union. So now I move to the first point, is political and institutional factors. Well, and this is, of course, a very good example to test European integration theories. I think all of us did it at some point during our master or doctoral thesis courses. So it's about who plays a bigger role, member states, EU institutions, how the European Commission can employ political intervention in one form or another, and so on and so on. And of course, what is happening now in the European Union, well, it's the targets, the policy priorities that have been communicated by the European Commission. Of course, they do not face unanimous agreement, many of them, and some political disagreements were on the pages of newspapers for this month about raising targets. Some member states objected. About budget, we just learned some days ago that the negotiations again went in troubles, and what will be the outcome, because that should be agreed very fast. And of course, member states have different policy priorities, different objectives, and as energy mix is still in the competence of member states, just remember the Lisbon Treaty provisions on the energy mix. So member states can decide what energy mix they prefer. And very sensitive questions are, of course, about nuclear phase out. Some countries definitely decided to phase it out. Germany is the biggest example, the brightest example, but some countries, non-nuclear countries in the European Union, want to start their the construction of their nuclear plants. For example, Poland and Estonia are quite serious about this. Then, of course, we have coal regions, and we will discuss it as a second point about just transition. We have coal regions in the European Union, which depend on coal power generation, and a lot of people are employed in mining sectors. And this is a big question, what to do for them if the decarbonization targets shall be implemented. And the reform of the Energy Charter Treaty, I will speak about this in the investment protection, during investment protection discussion. And of course, this is a bit unclear how to reform the ECT, and whether all member states would support an unanimous approach, because also they have investments in different member states, and some of them may prefer to ensure protection of the investment in another member state. And of course, a bit of lack of competence, so taxation is also a very pressing issue. Lack of finance, well, Next Generation is very generous, but let's see how it ends up. So political and institutional factors, of course, are on the top of all problems, and without a driving force, it can be very difficult to achieve something. So now we move to a second challenge. It's how to ensure just transition. And just transition is about not leaving anyone behind, as I mentioned before. And to achieve the European Green Deal, to implement decarbonization, to implement a transfer to low carbon economy in all sectors, which I mentioned before in this nice graph, to implement it, different member states and even regions within member states will be affected differently. And it will inevitably create winners and losers. And the main goal, of course, is to avoid. And in some cases, the European Green Deal, as with its goal of decarbonization, brought a next step of reforms of policy actions, let's put so, which member states need to achieve. And in some cases, some member states still need to implement let's say, the first step is liberalization market reforms, which were foreseen in the energy sector by the third energy package. So they still need to do a bit of homework to implement these provisions, not only in law, in domestic laws, but also to implement them in practice. And that's what I call leapfrogging for some regions. And by these regions, I keep in mind, of course, Southeast European member states, which still need to take an extra mile in order to complete, let's put it so, complete the third energy package implementation. And that will be an additional work for them. And it's essential also to take into account and to assist them, not to leave them on their own. And of course, I already mentioned coal regions. Coal regions in transition is a big EU-led platform which aims to bring this discussion and maybe to find solutions. And coal regions, of course, need to phase out power plants, coal-generated power plants, which becoming increasingly unprofitable. This is not only about decarbonization as part of climate change agenda. It's also about economic realities. So either you close up coal plants now and you find some solutions and you move further, or let's put in a couple of years, in a decade, it will run completely unprofitable and without subsidies. Even now, without subsidies, you cannot run most of them. And in 10 years, you will face the same problem, but with bigger consequences. But of course, the main question is about job losses. And that's very sensitive. Take any countries, let's put Bulgaria, where every time when the government wants to do something, to remove some subsidies, to increase prices, there are protests and they are regular. And the existence of the government, of the current government, depends also on miners. who could come out in the street and protest against any reforms. So, of course, that's a very tricky issue that I do not have an answer, and any answers would be very complicated and will depend on many factors. But of course, one of the solutions, one of the ideas is about value chain creation, added value chain creation, creating new manufacturers, creating new production in these regions, and replacing coal mining, for example, with new economies. And in Southeast Europe, recently we published a study. We did a study on the offshore wind opportunities, and in the Black Sea in Southeast Europe, offshore wind was a bit neglected. The region was a bit neglected in all debates on offshore wind, and we wanted to bring to the attention of the Commission and stakeholders, regional stakeholders, that actually offshore wind can be an opportunity for this coal transition for the regions. Offshore wind can work well with hydrogen installations for its capacity factor, and offshore wind has a very long value chain with a lot of jobs which could be created. And I will mention this study. I mentioned this study on the last slide. You can also have a look at it. And also on coal regions, we published this May a study which actually sets up this conceptual framework that this is a time to start doing something. So the third challenge, food for thought, is about decarbonizing energy sector. And this is about what is clean energy, the definition of the clean energy. It's clear now that fossil fuels should be phased out. That's very clear. They should be phased out, maybe not completely, but their share will remain negligible by 2050. And one of the news is that natural gas seems to be no longer transition fuel for EU decarbonization efforts, and it has a lot of consequences for the industry, and of course it has a lot of consequences for power generation in member states and for stakeholders, for companies operating in this sector. Then, of course, there are a lot of discussions how to decarbonize energy sector, and you will see such proposals as going full electric. So everything should be electric, of course electric, but based on 100% renewable electricity. But then we have the question of what to do with hard-to-abate sectors, and by hard-to-abate sectors I mean some industries which require specific temperatures, like steel, for example, and also some kinds of transport, like maritime transport. So other available technologies to make the sectors functioning on full electrification. That's a big debate and a big question. Of course, about electrification, it should be based on renewable electricity, on renewable energy sources. And the question arises, so what, the question of base load capacity, because renewables are intermittent. So wind power is produced when wind is blowing, and solar power is produced when the sun is shining. And during the peaks or during the low generation modes of renewables, you need some base load, the so-called base load capacity, in order to ensure that the demand will be satisfied, that you have any generation capacity to satisfy the demand at any point of time. And it's the question, usually the base load capacity was coal and natural gas and nuclear. And if we need to phase out coal and we need to give up the natural gas, then the question, what would be base load? And of course, a lot of discussions about nuclear, which is a sensitive topic. Some member states, as I mentioned, continue to adhere to nuclear power. Some of them want to phase it out. But even in the long-term strategy of the European Union, which I mentioned, which was published in 2018, even in this long-term strategy, nuclear capacity, nuclear generation capacity will remain at least around 80%, depending on on these 8 scenarios. They're different, but at least 80% of existing installed capacity now will remain by 2050. And this raises also a question of technological sovereignty of the nuclear industry. If nuclear industry will not receive support, it will not be qualified as a sustainable source in sustainable finance, how this industry would preserve its technological sovereignty, how it will ensure that also humans' capacities and also industrial capacities will be enough to ensure smooth operation by 2050. This is a big question, and it's under discussion now. And of course, hydrogen, we will speak about it in more details later. But currently, most hydrogen is not clean. So it's the so-called gray hydrogen. And to produce cleaner hydrogen, you need either carbon capture storages, or you need electrolysis, which means production from electricity, which is generated from renewable energy. And of course, the question is about effectiveness, is about hydrogen's low calorific value. We will discuss it later. Second question about energy sector is about electrification. According again to long-term strategy of the European Commission, by 2050 there will be additional electricity around 2,000 terawatt-hour, and the share of electricity in final energy consumption should reach over 50% of final energy consumption. And to give you a sense of this figure, 2,000 terawatt-hour equals to approximate all entire Central and Southeastern Europe and Nordic countries final energy consumption, not electricity, final energy consumption now, approximately. So you can have an idea of how much additional electricity should be installed and produced by 2050. And this electricity, this huge amount of electricity, should be mostly renewable energy based, and at least 70%, over 70% are expected to be renewable based. And this will have significant implications for the internal electricity market design and the electricity market design that was created by the third energy package, by the relevant directives. Because currently electricity market is energy only market. It means that the price, the day-ahead price, the price on the spot, like for the day, is set by the variable production cost of the marginal power plant. So the last power plant which needs to satisfy demand. And it means when with a larger penetration of renewables, this price will continuously decrease and will be continuously increasingly volatile. And that would raise a very serious question for investors, how to invest, how to take long-term investments in a volatile and low wholesale energy price market. So this is what's called the decoupling effect between investments and price signals. And this is exactly what is in the design of the electricity market, which needs to be addressed to some extent, because in the longer term it will cause, and it's causing a lot of investors' concerns. Let's put it so. And of course, renewable energy sources are intermittent, as I mentioned, and the question remains, what baseload capacity should we have? Because without baseload capacity, this is very difficult to ensure secure supply, power supply. So would it be storage, electricity storage? A lot of work is doing, a lot of companies, a lot of businesses are trying to find solutions, maybe in the future. Nuclear, a big question mark. There is no consensus in the European Union. So, and here I just wanted to give you an example from the long-term strategy, which foresees installed capacity according to different scenarios. So it's about baseline and 8 scenarios. And here you can see very well that solar and wind will occupy over 70%, sometimes even nearly 80% of installed capacities, and the nuclear will be reduced, but not that much drastically as we may expect. And fossil fuels will remain marginal, not to exceed 10% of installed capacity in the EU. And that will mean a lot of work and a lot of questions, as I mentioned. Now, hydrogen. Well, it became really a very, very popular topic to discuss in Brussels. Hydrogen, everyone speaks about hydrogen, everyone writes book about hydrogen, but all in all, we have more questions than answers. And this summer, the European Union published EU hydrogen strategy. Well, tentatively, it foresees at least 6 gigawatts of renewable hydrogen in next 5 years, 4 years, and around 40 gigawatts in 10 years. That's quite a big number, given that currently hydrogen, like blue hydrogen with carbon capture storage, is still at a kind of an experimental phase. So a lot of work to be done. And 3 main concerns, 3 main challenges are listed on this slide. It's about costs, it's about technologies, it's about technical aspects, and it's about ability of renewables to satisfy the increase in demand for renewable electricity. So about costs, currently the production of green hydrogen, and by green I mean renewable hydrogen, which is produced by a means of electrolysis by electricity, which is of course renewable electricity, as I mentioned. And currently it's more expensive than, for example, hydrogen produced from methane, from natural gas. But of course, in order to be considered clean, hydrogen produced from methane should use either pyrolysis techniques or carbon capture storage. And it's quite complicated, and it's unclear when electrolysis, green hydrogen can become competitive. And of course, it's about cost retrofitting. So if you want to use existing infrastructure, existing gas infrastructure, and to inject hydrogen into this infrastructure, you need to upgrade it, to update it, because you can't just put the hydrogen into these pipelines, because the pipelines will be damaged. And of course, cost of retrofitting are quite essential. But, well, the gas industry currently is quite optimistic. They have no choice, I think, unless being very optimistic about their ability to join decarbonization efforts. And another aspect is technicalities, and it's about technical abilities of the pipelines, of the grids to inject hydrogen. So different member states have different admission rates, the percentage of hydrogen that can be injected in pipelines and be secure. And it's a question of calorific value. Hydrogen contains lower calorific value than natural gas, and of course it means that it contains, to simplify, less energy, and higher volumes are needed. And the third most important aspect is about renewable electricity. In order to produce green hydrogen, which is hydrogen produced by electrolysis, you need a huge amount of renewable electricity. And just remember the previous slides, we discussed that already for electrification, we need enormous amount of renewables to be installed. And just to add these gigawatts of hydrogen, it's very ambitious, and it needs to be planned very well, and it requires a lot of investments. So all in all, 3 main takeaways on the hydrogen debates. It's about colors: green, gray, blue, hydrogen, and so on. Where do we stand? Do we agree on it? Then about technological neutrality. Do we support, for example, nuclear hydrogen? Do we support blue hydrogen with carbon capture storage? Or do we support only green hydrogen from renewable electricity? That's a question. And the third question is about imports. We will need to import more quantities of hydrogen. And that's about geography of production. Do we need to import hydrogen from producers abroad, or we import, let's put it, methane, natural gas, and we produce hydrogen on site? A lot of debates currently. And the sixth challenge is about investments. As I mentioned, we need a lot of investments in clean energy, in renewable energy. And the question is what to consider clean sources, and what energy sources qualify for support, for funding of, for example, European Investment Bank or some European fundings, and we expect a lot of money will be available for this purpose. So what project would qualify? Sustainable finance taxonomy should be published by the end of this year, maybe next year, and we all expect whether nuclear will be included into this, and gas seems to have lost the game and is excluded, but it's still on hold, and there are a lot of debates. And the second point is about investment protection, is about the reform of the Energy Charter Treaty. I will not go much into detail because I worked the Energy Charter Secretariat, and well, I can speak very long about these issues, but the main idea is that the Energy Charter Treaty is the only one multilateral energy investment treaty which ensures the protection of investments for the companies of the contracting parties, of the companies of the states that signed, that are members of the Energy Charter Treaty. And to date, the Energy Charter Treaty is energy source agnostic, as I like to repeat. So it does not differentiate among energy sources. It protects fossil fuels, it protects solar panels, it protects coal plants, for example. And currently, this quite abandoned, quite forgotten in public debates treaty is in the center of debates, because the main question, how to reform? Should we reform this treaty? Should we exclude fossil fuels from the protection, from investment protection? And in this case, should investors be compensated for losing assets, or should we just remove investment protection for them? And of course, the question is whether member states and the European Union as a whole, and all member states except Italy that left in 2016 this treaty, all member states are contracting parties to the treaty. So their companies, the assets are protected in another member state. And there are some tensions, and some companies from one member state claimed arbitration, investment arbitration in another member state, because that member state wanted to, for example, phase out coal, to close up a coal power plant. And the main debate is whether we should stop protecting fossil fuels. But the main problem of this treaty is that in order to amend it, you need a consensus. And by consensus, I mean the agreement of all contracting parties, which include member states of the European Union, but also other countries like Central Asian countries, Japan, and many others, Turkey to name, South Caucasus. So all of them need to agree, and all of them have very different interests. And the ongoing negotiations, I think the third round of negotiations was held this November. Well, at least what was publicly communicated, it was not that successful for this very reason. And now there is a rising voice of, especially of climate activists, that the European Union and also of the European Parliament put it, whether the European Union need to withdraw from the treaty, to leave the treaty if the treaty cannot be amended. But the problem is the so-called sunset clause, that any contracting party that leaves the treaty will be obliged for next 20 years under the investment protection obligations. That means that for next 10 years, even if the European Union shuts the door, member states and the European Union on its own will be responsible. A big question, a big debate. So the Energy Charter Treaty is again in the Brussels bubble debate. And shortly about the last challenge is about the external dimension. And the European Green Deal communication last December said it clearly that it strives for a climate neutral continent by 2050. And by climate neutral continent extends beyond EU member states. It extends beyond Eastern Europe. It covers also Russia. It covers Turkey. It covers Caspian seas. Depends on how you define the continent. So it brings a very essential issue: how to ensure cooperation, how to motivate the others, the biggest emitters and immediate emitters: Russia, Turkey, India. Well, as the United States now may change their position, but many others still need to be convinced, and there should be elaborated some kind of cooperation. And just these days, the delegation, for example, the delegation of the EU to Russia and Scuola Energy Center, they organized together the big climate conference, EU-Russia climate conference, that was supposed to be in this March, cancelled because of the pandemic. And it brought experts from both sides just to sit and maybe to launch a dialogue, at least at the expert level. We look forward to expanding this debate, but still, this is a stepping stone, a first step. And the second point is, of course, this cooperation needs to be based on rules, trade rules, and investments, of course, come when the carbon price is high. So to make investments profitable, it's easy, it's economics. And whether you like to consider it more defensive aspect, more protectionist aspect, or whatever position you would prefer to take, well, it's all about carbon border adjustment mechanisms, CBAM, as it's called now. Now, under the consideration by the European Commission, there are several options in the form of tax, in any kind of emission trading schemes. Very complicated, very difficult, and very challenging which sectors to cover, how this carbon border mechanism will work, who will have access, and so on. Still on hold, and a lot of questions. And of course, external actors, especially big emitters, are not that happy about this. And the main question is that any mechanism should be compatible with WTO rules. So here I end up, and on this slide I just put recent works of our team on the Green Deal, and there are a couple of references on electricity sector reforms, what I mentioned today about the future of gas. My colleagues worked on it, and coal regions, so we did a study, the offshore wind, of course, my publication on the Energy Charter Treaty, and finance and sustainable finance and just transition funds. So thank you very much. I hope I didn't run out of time too much.
Don't worry.
Yes,
thank you very much, Irina. I will stop the sharing. Thank you very much. I think it was very, very interesting, and now we will open up the Q&A. Let me just say that, I mean, you gave so many examples of how, you know, how much this topic is, and the green transition is having societal, economic, technological, and legal effects, and they are, you know, one affecting each other, and they are so important also in economic terms, that clearly what is going to be decided in the next few months for the next generation EU at the country level is, let's say, to a certain extent, affecting an amount of money that is not usually seen in European countries in so very few years. And so this is also the reason why we see so much the discussion in several tables. Let me stop the sharing, sorry, the recording, as I mentioned, and I will open the Q&A.